Right then, hello everybody, this is a feedback video for the Aberfan practice paper which you all completed for me in the last week or two. So what I'm going to do here is to talk through the two extracts so that you have the opportunity to red pen your own annotation with some further points here, which hopefully will both improve your skills for picking out features for paper 2, but also will help you when you come to actually make any changes to your own work. So we'll begin then with source A, the essay written by Laurie Lee, titled "The Village That Lost Its Children," about the Aberfan disaster. Now, to begin then, the first thing I'd like to do here, which actually nobody did, is to talk about the title, "The Village That Lost Its Children." Well, the first thing I would say here is that there is something almost fairy tale-like. It's like there's something out of the Pied Piper here. The village that lost its children. It sounds like a story, and I think that's indicative because a lot of the structure of this text is very like that of a narrative. The first half of a narrative, beginning with the sort of exposition, you have that sense of rising action up to the climax, which is the final paragraph, which describes the actual disaster itself. So let's begin then. Firstly then, at the beginning of the first paragraph, few people had ever heard of Aberfan until disaster struck it. Now, in a sense then, there's you could argue there's almost an element of a sort of flashback type thing going on here, in the sense that it implies the disaster, and then the next sentence, it was just another of the small mining villages, so it goes on then back to the start of the story and actually fills us in. But the point that many of you actually emphasise very successfully at the beginning here is about the anonymity of Aberfan. Few people had ever heard of it. Just another mining village. The way that that's quantified, another, implying that there are so many others like it, emphasising its size, it's small. Many of you talk very effectively about the the kind of paradox almost, or the sort of deceptive nature of that verb phrase tucked away, the contrast between the implications there of safety and security, which is kind of ironic given that the first sentence has already revealed to us in a way what's going to happen at the end. There's a sense of kind of complacency, which again some of you mentioned very well, a sense of complacency that such a thing was completely unexpected, was never expected to happen. Further to the general point about its anonymity there, you have phrases like, a huddle of terrace houses. Again, you can actually group that that noun there with the idea of it being tucked away. Again, it's got these associations of security, and it talks about anonymity, but actually, if anything, the thing that stands out here is this sense of ugliness. Now, you could link that very effectively to some of the descriptions later on, which many of you alluded to, associated with the darkness. You have the reference to as black as the Styx, a river black as the Styx, but there's grime, there's various other references to darkness that you could associate with that ugliness too, and of course that darkness can be seen structurally as foreshadowing the death and the disaster that would later come to Aberfan. That's probably the main thing there, I think, in terms of that first paragraph. The second one then, its heart was the coal pit. Now, again, if we think about this here, we think about a heart obviously as being something which is life-giving, as being joyful or loving, and yet here, a coal pit, we're talking about a heart that is black, that is giving death, that is polluting, and of course that is going to destroy this village. So there's a kind of really dark irony there that you might well pick up on. let's have a think then. Looking at vocab that's used to describe it, nouns like debris, this sense that the natural landscape, which so often is a symbol of hope. If you think, for example, about in our study of the Merchant of Venice, this idea of the green world, the landscape as a sort of escape. Here it's no escape, because the landscape itself is polluted by this debris of this industry, which itself is described using another excellent adjectival phrase, this slowly exhausting industry. You have a sense really here of a village that is in itself already dying, I suppose. And the adjectives that are used: disused, decaying, exhausting, real bleak, hopeless stuff. But I suppose this seems like a village that was heading for a slow and an anonymous death. The kind of tragedy here is that what this disaster does is it replaced that slow anonymous death with a sudden disastrous one. To continue though, a river black as the Styx. Now, many of you unpack that very effectively, talking again about the sort of way that it foreshadows the deadly ending, but again about the sort of sense here of somewhere that is approaching death. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some good grouping took place there in terms of other references to darkness, which was very effective as a cluster of quotations. The most successful people, I think, at this point also grouped that with the idea of pyramids, which he mentioned later on, because again, of course, pyramids, what are they? But they are, funerary monuments. They are monuments to the dead. So again, you have that structural significance there. We mentioned other ways that it's described. Of course, obviously, you have things like blistered as well, which actually works quite well back with disused and exhausting as well. So that covers, I suppose, these first couple of paragraphs. But again, if you think about this in terms of the structure of a narrative, which I suppose will come into your question 4 particularly, you have here this idea of the building up of setting, exposition. We're not yet building up to the kind of climax, but it feels like the beginning of a narrative, the way that this sets the scene. So, let's move on then and look at a little more. It goes on then: such villages learn to accept a twilight world where most of the menfolk worked down the pits. Now, if you think about even the word pit itself, which is used informally or colloquially as slang for a mine, but think about what that actually implies. A pit, simply a hole. Think about colloquially how you use that. If something is described as the pits, it means something that is the very worst. And again, I suppose it just serves to describe the nature of this industry. Having set the scene, though, the focus in this paragraph actually shifts, and in a sense it describes characters. It moves on with exposition details of character. And so, for example, it talks about how people worked down the pits, clearly. Many died early. Again, linking to this idea of the slow tragedy of Aberfan. Their lungs full of coal dust, and the life was traditionally grim and perilous. Not too much to add there, other than the fact that obviously in grim and perilous you've got some good adjectives there that you might want to unpack. Let's see then. Disaster, in fact, was about the only news that ever came out of the valleys. The sudden explosion underground, miners entombed alive, or the silent death in the dark from gas. Wales and the world were long hardened to such news, but not to what happened in Aberfan. So there's a kind of juxtaposition then here building between a world that is already harsh, nasty, brutish and short, to borrow a quotation from another writer, from Hobbes. But clearly here then this is being juxtaposed against this sudden disaster. And the way that paragraph ends with that sudden, rather dramatic volta, but not to what happened in Aberfan, which implies, doesn't it, that what did happen then was on another level entirely. This paragraph focused on the human model. Now, though, we're about to hit rising action, because we've had the static description of what the place looks like. we've had this characterization of the lives that people live. Notice, though, that it's quite anonymous. There's no sense of it being personalised. The people here are seen as this kind of mass, in a sense that it is an industrialised village, its people are industrialised. They are generalised as if they are all parts of the same industrial machine. That perhaps quite interesting. But anyway, we move on. We have some rising action, some tension starting to build. A coal mine sends to the surface more waste than coal, and a mining village has to learn to live with it. It must be put somewhere or the mine would close, and it's too expensive to carry it far. So the tips grow everywhere, straddling the hillsides, nudging the houses like black-furred beasts. Almost everyone, from time to time, has seen danger in them, but mostly they are endured as a fact of life. Now, a couple of things. It must be put somewhere. In that description, somewhere in that, I suppose, that adverb, there is a sense that actually where it's put is not that significant. Little care is taken. When he describes in the second half of that sentence, it's too expensive to carry it far, we see a situation where clearly then economics is valued more highly than people's lives and people's safety. Again, it's kind of foreshadowing, it's sort of foreboding towards what will happen later. But there's a sort of implication then, isn't there, that this is not just an act of God, that there is a system to blame here. You know, ultimately, those tips were where they were, collapsed as they did, because they had been put there. So we do get a sense of an implied blame. Now, in terms of the way that they're described, you've got the verb to grow, and straddling, nudging. So metaphorically then, what we're looking at here is this presentation of it as something animalistic or monstrous, and indeed it goes on to describe black-furred beasts, which you could link in the blackness to the grime that we talked about earlier in this video, and the blackness of the sticks. But yes, this sense of a monster which menaces it. If we look then now at the kind of further sense of rising tension, the next paragraph goes on to talk about 7 tips. So having described a tip in the previous paragraph, we now have a sense then of escalation. There is not 1, there are 7. Now look at what else it describes. The evening sun sank early behind them. Now, we've all talked before about this conceptual metaphor where you can associate mornings and dawns with new beginnings and hope and optimism. We've also therefore talked about how evenings can be associated with death, with decline, and things like that. So the fact here that Laurie Lee chooses to describe the evening sun, again, is an image foreshadowing death, and the fact that that sinks early, therefore, symbolises premature death, which again, obviously structurally, is foreshadowing through to what happens here. Now, when, on the next sentence, it begins to talk about to some of the younger generation, we're starting to move round to the idea of children. So he's starting to allude to the people who will, in fact, be the victims of this tragedy. Now, that also is significant because, as we talked about before, again, children and animals are very often seen as emotive topics, more so perhaps than description of accidents to adults. And so if you think about the way that it describes earlier on in this text accidents to adult coal miners as being, accepted parts of life, well, here what we then start to get a sense of is Laurie Lee progressing towards the eventual protagonists, if you like, of this tragedy, children. Some of the younger generation, they had always been there as though dumped by the hand of God. Now, there were some excellent analyses of this, particularly that verb dumped, and again, the implication is that there is a sense of carelessness associated with it. The sense that nobody cared about what happened in places like Aberfan. But I think if we link that back to what we were talking about in the previous paragraph, the sense that someone was to blame for this, it gives us a measure then, doesn't it, of the level of cruelty that took place, that something could happen as dreadful as this. What else then? They could be seen from the school windows immediately below them, rising like black pyramids in the western sky. Again, the west linking with the setting of the sun. You could group that obviously with the idea of the sunset that we talked about a moment ago. We talked about how the thing about the black pyramids link very well to the idea of the sticks. We talked about pyramids as being funeral monuments, and the fact that they're explicitly described here as black, again, obviously relates to the fact that it's coal waste, but the fact that they're black, again, you have that further association of deathliness. Now, at the beginning of the paragraph that ended on line 20, I mentioned that you had that volta at the end of the paragraph, but not to what happened in Aberfan. Now, Laurie Lee actually uses the identical structure here now on the end of this paragraph once again to inject further tension. Because what does he do? He goes on, but they were not as solid as they looked. It was known that several had moved in the past, inching ominously down the mountain. So structurally there again, the end of each paragraph there, similar technique used twice to build tension. Many of you talk very effectively about that verb phrase, inching ominously, about the verb use and the adjective there. And I think that clustered very well, as again some of you did with the previous paragraph, the references to verbs like nudging and straddling. So there were some very good comments about that. The sense of the inching ominously down the mountain again, the sense of building tension, building the inevitability. If we think about this as being structured rather like a narrative, it's building everything focused towards the climax. So, let's then now move on to look at the next section. What was not known, however, was that the newest tip, number 7, was a killer with a rotten heart. Now, the language here is dramatic, you might almost say melodramatic, and suddenly then, linking to the way in which it was described previously as being almost monstrous or animalistic, it almost goes beyond that now to something that is personified, almost psychopathic here, that is menacing these people. Many people analyse this idea of the rotten heart, which actually links very, very well to that description at the beginning that we talked about the mines being described as the heart of the village. I think you could cluster this very effectively with that. So that's something there to bear in mind. What else then? It had been begun in Easter 1958. Now, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect anybody to get this, but I mean, Easter is interesting because, of course, symbolically, Easter is all about resurrection, isn't it? It's the festival where Jesus is killed and buried, and then a couple of days later, brought back to life. You could, if you wanted, perhaps say that there's some kind of irony here, because if that offers us hope of resurrection, it is a hope that is going to be dashed, because there will be no Easter miracle for these children. They will be killed when their school is struck by this landslide, and of course there is no saving them. But that's quite a sophisticated point, nonetheless. Now, it talks here then about gradually and over the years. So again, you have, linking to earlier, you have all of this text is leading towards this eventual disaster, and we have again this sense of its inevitability, that adverb gradually, which is then doubled by that, similarly by that sort of adverbial phrase, over the years. The fact that those two are then doubled together there at the start of that sentence, again, it builds the sense of it happening. The fact that the water is described as fatal seeping. Now, fatal, again, in terms of that adverb there, describes quite effectively the fact that this is going to be something that will kill people, there's almost an oxymoron there, because we think of something seeping as being relatively insignificant, and yet the fact that that seeping is described as fatal shows how something as simple as this, something as small as the neglect over them choosing to put this tip next to the village for pure economic reasons, for saving of money, emphasises how something so small can have such catastrophic effects. And indeed, you could perhaps juxtapose there this insignificance, this fatal seeping. You could juxtapose that with the beast-like, the bestial imagery. You could juxtapose that with the sort of the metaphor of, or the personification of the killer with the rotten heart. And finally, the mountain of moving muck, which is not an elegant expression, but the alliteration there obviously really sort of seeks to, I suppose in its very clumsiness, emphasises the size and the scale of what was being unleashed. Now, we've said then that this now is building up to a climax. Now, in this paragraph here, we have that phrase, then one morning, and so with this sort of temporal adverbial phrase, the narrative picks up a pace. Then one morning, out of the mist. Again, link that idea of out of the mist back to the idea of a monster, back to the idea of a killer. Out of the mist, the unthinkable happened, and the tip came down on the village. The children of Pantglass Junior School had just arrived in their classrooms and were right in the path of it. They were the first to be hit by the wave of stupefying filth, which instantly smothered more than 100 of them. Now, on one level, some of the language here actually seems surprisingly mundane. The tip came down is a very, very mundane verb phrase. I think perhaps we can argue that Laurie Lee is suggesting that actually he doesn't need to describe this in hyperbolic terms. The scale of this disaster is such that that actually he can let events speak for themselves. Now, on that third sentence, they were the first to be hit. I suppose this is the point where he starts to unleash. The verb hit hits home, is short, is particularly kind of, sort of dramatic in that. And then suddenly, this metaphor kind of explodes out of this sentence by the wave of stupefying filth. Links back, I suppose, to the moving muck of previously, but I suppose in a way, in this sentence, the description of that wave hits us with just as much drama, just as much lack of announcement, if you like, as that original disaster would in fact have done. Now, the fact that it's children, the fact that it's junior school children, again, children are seen metaphorically as being these optimistic beacons of hope and the future. Laugh about that if you will. The fact that it's children who are being cut off here is obviously more emotive than if it were adults, and again, in a sense, is kind of juxtaposed to the normal everyday descriptions of adults dying down mines at the beginning of this extract. We now get this sense that it is these children that are being killed. Now, there's a further idea here, the sense that these children are being made to pay for the mistakes of their elders. They are innocent in this. They have not had any role in placing this here. And so, therefore, I suppose that increases our sense of sympathy, our sense of pathos at this, that they are, to borrow the phrase, suffering for the sins of their fathers. They are paying for this. the inattention of society has killed them just as surely as if it had lined them up and shot them. Final paragraph, this single sentence. The catastrophe was not only the worst in Wales, but an event of such wanton and indifferent cruelty. It seemed to put to shame both man and God. Wanton and indifferent cruelty. There's a savage indictment here building, I think, in the system that allowed this to happen. It's a pretty strong thing. And it groups man and God almost as equals in culpability here. Because I suppose if we view this text from a Christian perspective, the fact that it talks about man and God, well, in reality, God would be seen to control man. So whichever way you look at this, it's an indictment of society, it's an indictment of the world that it is. It's a short, dramatic, thought-provoking, tragic ending to this extract. And so, as we mentioned earlier, the narrative structure here is very much the case, and it's very apparent through this text how it builds, just like a narrative, to this ending. Now, several of you made quite good comments about the fact that this was a sort of an essay, and it is. This is, although it is a non-fiction text, it actually responds to this disaster in, as we said, in quite a narrative way. It treats it like that. Sometimes we use the phrase literary non-fiction to suggest a non-fiction text that borrows conventions from literature, from a more narrative background, and clearly that's what this is. And yes, the fact that this is written a year after the fact means that Laurie Lee, who was not himself personally involved, is able to sort of reflect on this and to retrospectively impose the order and the logic of this narrative structure on these events that took place. Because obviously, as we all know, real life is not in itself a narrative. Real life does not neatly fit these structures in the same way. But that's what he's able to do.